I want to address the Aristotelian necessity for change in created beings as it relates to the problem of being, to elucidate some of the philosophical themes that are relevant to the creation and the fall of Adam. In his Physics, Aristotle refuted some Eleatic philosophical trends denying the existence of change. Now, Aristotle proposes that nothing can come into being or become in itself or from what it is not. That's pretty self-evident. But being is not merely a creatio ex nihilo, or something being created out of nothing. There's a lot more problems with that. I wanted to note also that God is not a thing also that would categorically fit being a thing created from itself or being created out of nothing or anything like that. Categorically, God does not fit here. God created the world. Here's some clarifications. God is not categorically subject to change as created beings are. Aristotle is going to deal with this more in his Metaphysics. But the Thomistic cosmological argument is unsatisfactory here, that God's the first cause, and we can deduce this from seeing cause and effect and necessary connections when we observe nature. But because God of the Bible, He's our axiom, and He's not our rational conclusion, we cannot logically prove God like this. And God of the Bible is not concluded by the reductio ad absurdum of the false dilemma of infinite regress. We can't just say that it's absurd that cause and effect goes off into infinity, into the beginning. We can't just conclude that or say that that's absurd, therefore the God of the Bible exists. All those things just don't follow. For the God of the Bible is in Himself, in His perfect fellowship, He's infinite, and He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. But here on change, the Aristotelian notion of change is a dialectic. It requires several things. It requires a subject coming into being. It also requires a form and the privation of that form. So that is that Adam was the subject created, but he was made very good. That's his form. And he had not sinned, but potentially he could transgress from a commandment which was instituted by God, and that's his privation. So sinned, in that Adam sinned, that was his change from very good to degenerated or fallen. So he was able to change. All the conditions were necessarily created by God and determined so. So Adam was created with conditions that would make Adam culpable in the institution of the commandment. In the institution of the commandment, the covenant of works isn't a privity, it's not a common law, it's a perfect law, and God had issued it so that His purpose would come to pass. The atonement of Jesus Christ, glorification of His Son, and that we'd be redeemed, all for the purpose and glory of God and His perfect fellowship in the Trinity. And these were purposefully ordained, correlating with God's foreknowledge of Adam's choice. And Adam had an intellect, but his categories of experience, presumably not knowing good and evil, and his capacity of being deceived by the serpent, they did not match God's intellect or God's will. Ultimately, Adam is not God or ever was. So, Frankie Lee 77, he writes, "In clear words, you accuse God for masterminding the affairs and deliberately causing chaos and sufferings of humanity." He goes on to say, "You are saying that God is not holy. You believe that God is omnipotent, but not holy God. If you say that God foreknew Adam would fall, then it is clear indictments on God in which you have no authority over God. Why do you want to judge God like Calvin did? Why do you add things to God and accuse Him of misdeeds? If you continue to believe that God foreknew about Adam's fall, and can quote references in scriptures which are nonsensicals to begin with, you are believing the exact lie Satan told Eve. I believe God is honest and has integrity, and if He were to know that Adam would fall in all common sense and righteousness, God would not cause all these chaos. You are free to slander God and ascribe things about Him. You cannot see that God is honest and holy and will not do such wicked deeds." Now, Frankie Lee 77 is suggesting And if God ordains evil by decree, then that would mean that God is culpable for sin. So we're going to look at some of these themes here. And we're going to start with a few verses. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 4. And the Lord hath made all things for himself, ye even the wicked for the day of evil, or the wicked so that he could be judged in evil. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, I form the light and I create darkness. I make peace and I create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. We say in 1 John chapter 1, verse 5, This is the message which we have heard of him, and declare unto you that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. We know that God does not tempt man. Also in James chapter 1 says, Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted, and he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. That is, from his fallen, wicked, and evil nature under Adam's federal headship, and not from God. He's a subject in bondage to sin, and not subject in bondage according to God's predestination over every single thing that the man does. Now, God's wrath against those fit for destruction, we can see is righteous and just throughout the Bible. If God comes to save those by grace through faith who deserve judgment and condemnation, does this make God unholy? Romans chapter 9, verses 18 and 23, Therefore he hath mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he hardeneth. Thou wilt say unto me, Why doth he yet find fault? Here's our question here. For who hath resisted his will? This is the exact question posed by the Arminians and even the atheists. And Paul's response is, Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say unto him that formed it, Why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay, and the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? What if God, willing to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he hath afore prepared for glory? So the question here posed by the Wesleyans and the Arminians is really a categorical fallacy. How can you find fault in me if you've determined me to be so in this way? It's a debased argument to begin with. Now, in a debate with an opponent, he made the following syllogism. His major premise was that God decrees all things that come to pass, and by this, in the context of our discussion, he meant by that he predestinates all things that come to pass, and he also creates all things. And his minor premise was that mankind sins, and that God thus, his conclusion is that God is responsible or culpable for sin. Now, this argument, I've heard it phrased in many ways, but there are some problems with this. Not only does it oversimplify and reduce God to a single symbolic variable, it is thus a categorical fallacy because it does that, but also it is a necessary cause fallacy, and it's also a false dilemma. And this is because it confuses the necessary cause with the sufficient cause. Now, Heidegger is of some help here, the philosopher Martin Heidegger, because he famously marked that there was a distinction between the Latin word causa, which is merely a determined effect, and the Greek aetion, which implies some kind of moral responsibility for when you cause something. So when we say God decrees or causes or determines things, it's probably more apt to use that Latin meaning, which implies more of an effect, the causa. Now, we are talking about beings who were determined to be responsible for their own work. That's how they were made. And true that beings would have no power unless it was given to them from above, but mankind is a slave to sin, and their will is captive to bondage, being dead therein. We can see this in Romans chapter 6. They are no slave to God. They are free from righteousness, but they are still a slave to unrighteousness. And nor does Calvinism teach that mankind is impelled or coerced to sin or tempted by God.